Yet another inconclusive meeting to reach a deal between Hamas and Israel. It comes as the Israeli military is threatening a ground offensive in Rafah at the southern tip of Gaza. So does diplomacy still stand a chance in this war, and why does Rafah matter? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Israel is threatening a ground offensive in Rafah. Humanitarian organizations have warned of a catastrophe if it goes ahead. Behind the scenes, mediators are still trying to broker a ceasefire deal. The possible ground offensive into Rafah has raised the stakes at the negotiations, which resumed this week. What would it take for Hamas and Israel to reach an agreement? There's lots to discuss with our guests, but first this report on the situation in Rafah.
Israel is intensifying its aerial bombardment of Rafah, the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip. At least 1.5 million Palestinians have fled there, taking refuge in tents and makeshift shelter. Many have been displaced several times, escaping Israeli bombs and following Israeli forced evacuation orders.
We were asleep at home when it happened, the sudden bombing. We didn't know what was going on. Gunshots burst from street to street, and we also heard fighter jets and helicopters roaring. Then we were hit by missiles. We were in total shock, and we didn't know where to hide.
Earlier in the war, the Israeli military designated Rafah a safe zone. Now it's threatening a ground offensive. Trapped between the Egyptian border and the Mediterranean Sea, terrified civilians have nowhere left to go. The looming Israeli operations given ceasefire negotiations in Cairo an added element of urgency. Hoping for a diplomatic breakthrough, Egyptian officials are hosting the Qatari Prime Minister, as well as the directors of the US and Israeli intelligence agencies. The first day ended without an agreement. It's not the only attempt to end the war. Last month, South Africa brought charges of genocide against Israel at the International Court of Justice. It followed that up on Tuesday with an urgent request asking the UN's top court to consider whether a ground operation in Rafah further violated Palestinian rights. To date, there's little evidence Israel has abided by the ICJ's ruling in January to take all measures possible to prevent acts of plausible genocide in Gaza. And even staunch Israeli allies seem to be changing their stance.
Too many of the over 27,000 Palestinians killed in this conflict have been innocent civilians and children, including thousands of children. And hundreds of thousands have no access to food, water, or other basic services.
And pointing fingers at or turning on one another.
How many times have you heard the most prominent leaders and foreign ministers around the world saying too many people are being killed? President Biden said this is too much on the top. It's not proportional. Well, if you believe that too many people are being killed, maybe you should provide less arms in order to prevent so many people being killed.
But given Benjamin Netanyahu's defiance of the ICJ and international opinion, how likely is it that a full-scale ground offensive of Rafah can be avoided? Paul Ging, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest in Durham, in the UK. Robert Geist Pinfold is a lecturer on peace and security at Durham University. His special expertise is the Israeli military. In Dubai, Hafsa Halawa is an independent political consultant who focuses on the Middle East, North Africa and the Horn of Africa. And in New York City, Omar Rahman is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to the program. Robert, how serious is this prospect of the military invasion of Rafah? How do you think it's just more of a push by the Israelis for political leverage during the talks which are underway for a deal?
I think it's a deadly serious push, and Israel has definite intentions to carry this out. Prime Minister Netanyahu has argued that there are 4 functional Hamas battalions in Rafah. Now, originally there were 24 operating Hamas battalions. Israel now argues that the surviving 4 are located solely in Rafah. So if Israel were to carry out its stated war aim of degrading and destroying Hamas militarily and rendering it politically unable to rule the Gaza Strip after the war, it therefore feels like a ground invasion of Rafah is not just inevitable, but necessary. And in fact, it's important to note that previously, the Israeli military elite suggested that Israel should prioritize Rafah for a ground invasion because this is obviously an area that sits on the border with Egypt. It's where most of the tunnels pass through, and Hamas's elaborate smuggling operation has been based in for many, many years. But Israel's political leadership vetoed that in favor of initial operation only in the north of Gaza, particularly around Gaza City. As Israel's failed to achieve its goals thus far in the war, it's been creeping slowly south, and Rafah is, of course, the last place on the map that's still under Hamas's control.
Hafsa, the Israelis have been saying that Rafah remains the final seat for Hamas key military battalions. Do you see the push for Rafah as a turning point in the war in Gaza?
Thank you, Hashem. And yes, I think we're at a major watershed moment in this conflict, not just because of the massive humanitarian cost of any talk of a ground invasion. We shouldn't forget that throughout the war and even in the last week, the Israelis continue to bombard Rafah. This is not an area that has been a safe zone as they initially labeled it as such when they urged citizens to move from Gaza City and further north down to the south, but also because, of course, it sits right on the border with Egypt. It's it's seen by the Egyptians as a major breach of their national security, and ultimately it brings into the question of where will these 1.34 million people go? The north, the rest of Gaza is effectively uninhabitable. There are no services. We've heard the talk of famine for months now, and now we're at a stage where this is really the Israeli government enacting what they promised in the first week after the attacks on October 7th, which is to flatten the strip.
Omar, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has been ordering the army to draw up plans to evacuate civilians from the city towards the north. And as Hafsa was basically saying, nowhere safe in Gaza. If the invasion takes place, what kind of impact do you see it having on the civilians based in the south?
I mean, don't take it from me. Take it from the head of the WHO, the head of the UN, the head of UNRWA, the head of all these UN agencies, anybody that's active on the ground, anybody that's been there and seen what Rafah looks like today and what the Israelis have done to the rest of the Strip has said this is an unfathomable catastrophe in waiting at the moment. Hafsa said there's nowhere else for people to go. Israel has driven 1.5 million people or less, because it was 250,000 in Rafah before the war started, into there. So that's the overwhelming majority of the Gaza Strip has been driven into Rafah, the small sliver on the border with Egypt. Most of those people are in tents, in shelters, starving, with nowhere to go. And the war machine that Israel has amassed is bearing down on them with what the ICJ has said is genocidal intent. So, despite what the other guest said about, war aims targeting Hamas, 4 battalions being there, we can't lose sight that the ICJ a few weeks ago said that Israel is plausibly perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinian people. And if you look at it through that lens, then what they have in store for the people of Gaza is as much military as it is psychological, to break the will of the people that are hanging on for dear life, that have amassed there, that are starving, and that Israel has demonstrated through its words and deeds, its intention is to push them into the Sinai Peninsula.
Robert, we've seen the war unfold through phases, the relentless bombardment of the northern part of of Gaza, and then the Israelis moved towards Khan Yunis, and each time they were saying basically the reason why they're doing this is to degrade the military capabilities of Hamas and deny Hamas a military presence, but also they're looking ahead to what happens next. Now, when it comes to Rafah, how would you see the scope of the invasion if it happens, and what kind of weaponry do you think the Israelis be using?
I suspect we'll see significant numbers of boots on the ground. Now, Israel has incurred significant military casualties in this campaign, but it is actually, those casualties, the numbers are lower than initial army estimates suggested. Now, just short of 600 Israeli military personnel have been killed since October the 7th, but still the majority of those were killed on October the 7th. So 4 months of fighting, there's been less Israeli casualties than on that one day. I think the Israeli military will be very keen to get in there. The problem here, as some of the other guests have alluded to, is that Israel has this unfolding humanitarian crisis on its hands, and that crisis is also an operational issue here because we have 1.5 million civilians crammed into this very small territory that used to be inhabited by around 250 people. So the potential for civilian casualties is even higher than it has been at other times in this military campaign. We have an acute problem of civilian casualties. Israel also has more of an acute need to avoid civilian casualties, on the other hand, because international pressure and condemnation is increasing. The Biden administration making it increasingly clear that it's losing patience with Israel, and it wants a ceasefire and it wants a de-escalation of hostilities as soon as possible. So Israel is in a race against time to achieve its very, very lofty goals that didn't really correspond to a limited incursion, but time is running out for it to do so.
But yeah, when you look at the situation on the ground, you see a totally different reality. Hafsa, 1.4 million people sheltering in tents without access to food, water and medicine. The United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Chief Martin Griffiths said that the military operation could lead to a slaughter in Gaza, yet the Israelis are saying they are adamant on the need to go there because they say that's the only way for them to crush Hamas. Do you still think that the international community can have some sort of leverage to stop the Israelis from moving forward?
I mean, just to also to comment on the previous intervention and to your question, the question of do they have leverage is very obvious. Yes, they do. Can they have leverage is a moot question because they haven't even used it. They haven't attempted to. The UN has made its pleas. The Security Council has had resolutions tabled that the United States has vetoed. The United States is the largest military arms supplier in both aid and arms sales to Israel. No leverage has yet been used by the international community, the biggest powers, namely by the United States, to try and prevent this. So we're sort of talking around in circles because we get these doublespeak statements from the White House and from different podiums in Washington telling us that they're incredibly concerned and they've explained these concerns. At no point in this campaign over the last 5 months has the United States moved to actually have Israel answerable to a number of incidents and actions that seem to fall far out of the ambit of the rules of engagement in conflict, let alone the intense bombardment, let alone the attacking of civilian infrastructure, humanitarian infrastructure like hospitals and other places. So we're actually more at a stage of talking about or asking ourselves, will the United States use its leverage? All indications to this point, even with such a slaughter, as Martin Griffiths very well points out, in Rafah looming, does not appear that it will use its leverage. So we have to move to expect that there will be no significant pushback against the Israelis moving forward on this invasion into Rafah.
Omar, the South African lawyers, when they put together their procedure towards for the ICJ, they were hoping to see the third parties, particularly states that provide substantial military financial assistance to Israel, be held accountable in the case of something similar to what happens now throughout Gaza, and particularly if the invasion of Rafah takes place. Is this something that could further resonate among the judges of the ICJ, knowing that the South Africans, they have asked officially the ICJ to consider whether a full-scale invasion of Rafah would violate the interim ruling that the court itself issued?
Yes, I think what's transpired over the past few weeks since their initial ruling definitely comes into play when the South Africans are going back to the ICJ to ask for further rulings, further injunctions, because of the situation being so urgent with what's happening on the border with Rafah. So I think they have to take that into consideration. Certainly, we all hoped that Israel's enablers over the past 4 months would have gotten the message from the ICJ and put pressure on Israel to halt its bombardment and to at least take seriously the 6 orders of the ICJ in terms of protecting civilians. Unfortunately, that has not happened. I totally agree with Hafsa in terms of her analysis on all of this. But we have to take the Biden administration's hand-wringing when it comes to Netanyahu with a sense of disingenuousness, because in spite of the rhetoric, the U.S. has continued to enable in every way. I mean, just 2 days ago, the U.S. Senate passed a $14 billion aid package to Israel. Now it still needs to go through the House, but that should tell you a lot. In spite of ruling of genocide, this is where we are.
Robert, when you look at post-October the 7th, you don't get a sense that the Israelis really have a sense of clarity about how to move forward militarily or politically, because people are wondering, why would the Israelis decide now to go for an offensive in Rafah when everything is at stake, particularly the talks which are behind closed doors to try to secure a political deal that would pave the way for the Israeli captives to be released? Yeah,
and I think what we're seeing here is a very delicate balancing act by Netanyahu, because he does have, and I want to challenge this view that there is no pressure from the Biden administration. I think that's an extremely one-sided interpretation. There is pressure from the Biden administration. It is at the moment largely behind closed doors. The Biden administration has tried to shape this war. It is getting increasingly frustrated at Israel's apparent non-compliance in what it wants to achieve and what it's asking for from the Israelis, but it is pressuring the Israelis behind closed doors. Over time, that may become increasingly public. So Netanyahu has that pressure on the one hand to de-escalate or agree to a ceasefire, or at least to tell us how this ends, like what the post-war scenario might look like. Robert, on the other hand, there's the coalition within Israel. Netanyahu is dependent on a far-right coalition who has said we will topple the government if there is a deal to free the hostages that ends in a ceasefire that doesn't end in Hamas destroyed. So it's in Netanyahu's best interest to remain ambiguous for as long as possible. And as a result, we're seeing Israel basically expanding its campaign because the military is not getting a clear enough basically direction of the war from the political echelons above it. Robert, that the general consensus in this part of the world, they absolutely don't believe that there is any push by the international community or the Americans to put an end to the war in Gaza or put any leverage on the Israelis, because set this aside and look at the scope of the massive destruction and the loss of life in Gaza, and then you get a sense that no one is doing anything to try to help the Palestinians. Hafsa, will this have any kind of impact on the talks underway to come up with a political agreement?
I mean, the talks are actually quite interesting in how they're running concurrent to all of this language coming out of the Israeli War Cabinet and from the Prime Minister, focused on Rafah. And, we continue to be in this cycle where we get a flurry of diplomacy from US officials who come to the region, this initially Egyptian proposal that has been amended and shaped into something that it is hoped there can be some meeting in the middle between Israel and Hamas. At the same time, I would just widen this scope a little bit. If we're talking about a political agreement, we cannot look at Gaza in a vacuum. What has happened in the West Bank since October 7th, thousands of Palestinians have been arrested, hundreds have been killed just since October 7th, let alone pre-October 7th and the violence ensuing, dispossession and, an increased armed civilian militia at the hands of the National Security Minister. This government in Israel has a very clear, concurrent and parallel policy it is looking to implement under the guise of this war in Gaza and under the guise of this bombardment in Gaza that seeks to root out Hamas. And the two are not mutually exclusive of one another, and they're not working separately of one another. They're very much in tandem. And I agree that Netanyahu is completely dependent on this far-right coalition. But in the same sense, this far-right coalition is dependent on the current circumstances, on this war, to continue to conduct its behavior and its activities across the entirety of the occupied territories. So even if we were to look at a hostage agreement and some kind of ceasefire in Gaza with a hostage prisoner swap, in the last one that we saw, more Palestinians were arrested than were released. So the entirety of the territories needs to be taken into account, which is not being done on a part of any of the actors around the table, be it in Cairo, in Paris, or at any point that they've met in recent weeks.
Omar, would it be possible for the Qataris, the Egyptians and the Americans to narrow some of the differences between Hamas and Israel? This is where they stand. Israel says that they will continue, even with a deal, they will continue their fight until they crush Hamas. Hamas, on the other hand, is saying they're not going to go ahead with any deal unless there is strong guarantee of a permanent ceasefire and the Israelis pulling out entirely from Gaza. Will it be possible for the mediators to narrow some of those differences?
Unfortunately, I don't see them coming together. Maybe narrow a bit, but ultimately, I think these two sides are too far apart. Israel, I think, is intent on pursuing this campaign to the end, and Netanyahu has made that clear. Total victory. What that means is a bit more obscure. Some people are reading into it the elimination of Hamas's military capabilities. Others are reading it to something far more sweeping against the Palestinian people in Gaza. I lean towards the latter. But I don't think that Netanyahu has any intention of stopping. I don't think there is even a prioritization of the hostages that remain there. If so, Israel would not be carpet bombing the Gaza Strip. It's already killed 31 of its own people, including 3 that were shot dead, waving white flags, trying to escape. And so I don't think there's any other interest here besides pushing all the way to the end and bringing the full weight of that military machine down on the Palestinian people that are there in the Gaza Strip.
Robert, you said if there was going to be any invasion of Rafah, is going to be boots on the ground. Now, if you look at the geography and the landscape, we're talking about area that borders Egypt. Do you see the Israelis moving forward? If they start pounding those areas, it's going to be closer to the military posts of the Egyptians with the potential of massive spillover?
Yeah, this has, as you say, the potential for regional consequences. It's something that this war is looking less and less limited to the Gaza Strip. We've had a mention of what's happening in the West Bank. There's the unfolding situation on the Lebanon border, and this conflict now risks spilling over to Egypt, which is the Sisi regime's worst nightmare. And they have warned Israel that any such spillover would basically abrogate the peace treaty between both countries. And what Sisi there is trying to do is to try and induce a stronger response from President Biden. The Egyptians will be talking to the Americans and saying, look, we need you to stop the Israelis going into Rafah, or at least minimizing their presence, because we cannot have this spillover. We cannot have anything that looks like we are complicit in the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip or the forced migration of Gazans from southern Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, because at this stage, these people have nowhere else to go. Israel won't let them return north to Gaza City, which has been essentially reduced to rubble, and it won't. And the Egyptians won't let them come over the border. So these 1.5 million displaced people are now more desperate than ever, more destitute than ever. But at the same time, there really is no clear exit strategy for these people, and that is where the Biden administration and the Egyptians together will be pressuring Israel to try and come to some sort of conclusion there.
Hafsa, should we take the Egyptians seriously when they warn that if the offensive takes place, that could jeopardize the decades-old peace treaty between Israel and Egypt?
I would love to confidently say that, yes, you could. My personal feeling is that now is the time to suspend the Camp David Treaty. I think that it is the only thing that may consequentially put some distance between the U.S. administration and the Israelis, and have the U.S. use significant leverage to ensure that the Rafah invasion doesn't go ahead. Sadly, this regime is incredibly, generally averse to conflict. It does not not want to risk. And I think in part the messaging over the last 5 months from the United States, even as late as 2 days ago, when President Biden insinuated that President Sisi, despite the mix-up of countries, that President Sisi had kept the border closed for humanitarian aid. We know at the time that that was an issue with the Israelis not wishing to have aid in and wanted to see people flow out. So they don't have confidence. At this point, I would argue that if they were to threaten to suspend the treaty, that the United States would actually take that seriously. Having said that, the Egyptians are also not a very, very sort of allergic to major knee-jerk policy decisions, especially under this leadership. And I don't see the Sisi regime following through, as much as I do believe it is the right policy move to make at this point.
Omar, if you look at the latest diplomatic push, it seems to be pretty much centered on this deal. But you look at the broader picture, you get a sense that we've moved beyond the phase of a deal and we're looking for new security arrangements. Who's going to take over Gaza? Is it going to be a new Palestinian leadership, Palestinian Authority? What kind of role will it have? Is this a legitimate thing to happen now? Or do you think this is something that the Palestinians themselves will ultimately have to decide in the future?
Well, certainly the Palestinians will have to decide and agree, because nothing will have any kind of legitimacy among the people without their consent. But I think what's taken place so far in terms of discussions has largely come out of the United States to find a way forward. They're kind of grasping at straws here, bring the Palestinian Authority back, something to that effect, have the Gulf states use their vast oil wealth to rebuild. But when it comes to the perspective of those states, the Arab states, the Gulf states, they don't want to be roped into a project of rebuilding without some kind of pathway to a permanent peace. Because in the end, then they're roped into kind of the same trap that the Palestinian Authority has in the West Bank, in which they are doing Israel's bidding. They're policing and governing on behalf of Israel while Israel continues to colonize the West Bank, Judaize Jerusalem, and all these kind of things without taking any serious steps for peace. So I think the Gulf states are very wary of being complicit in what Israel has done and fitting the bill for Israel's mess.
Robert Geist Pinfold, Hafsa Halawa, Omar, Rahman, I really appreciate your insight. Looking forward to talking to you in the near future. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.